Sad imam čast da najavim specijalnog gosta 31. Kopaonik Biznis foruma, gospodina Ivajla Izvorskog. Gospodin Izvorski je glavni ekonomista Svetske banke za Evropu i Centralnu Aziju. Od pridruživanja Svetskoj banci 2005. godine pa sve do danas, gospodin Izvorski je radio brojne analize za zemlje Evrope, Azije i Afrike. Doktorirao je na Yale univerzitetu. Gospodine Izvorski, izvolite.
So, dear Mr. Tabakovic, Mr. Vlahovic, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here in beautiful Kopaonik. I'm going to talk about two things, and one fits the general topic of the forum about the changing global context. First, I'm going to talk about the global context, then I'm going to talk about the huge opportunity and challenge for Serbia and the countries of Europe and Central Asia to grow to high income. And actually, I'm going to try to follow in the minister's very dynamic presentation of what Serbia is doing to grow to high income. You know, in the short term, the World Bank revised growth projections growth estimates for 2023 only modestly by half a percentage point, largely because of developments in developing economies excluding China. China grew less fast last year, and the United States. For Europe and Central Asia, we also are going to upgrade our estimates for last year, largely because our assessment of Russia is much better. Of course, regardless of that, the first 5 years of this decade, 2020, 2024, are the weakest 5 years of growth around the world since the 1990s. Actually, this says a lot about this. Nonetheless, and actually a lot of the guests at the forum have already remarked this, we have seen remarkable resilience across the global economy of Serbia, economy of the Western Balkans. So the big problem for all of us is that the convergence of the middle-income economies of Europe and Central Asia, Serbia, Western Balkans, two levels of the United States have slowed down quite dramatically. And this convergence actually, at the end of the day, determines the ability to have much better standards of living. Here is this assessment. You can see how we think of growth rates, much weaker growth rate in 2023. We are likely to see a slowing growth rate in 2024. A note on how we compare growth rates with the IMF. The aggregate growth rates for the IMF are aggregated based on purchasing power parity. For us, a market exchange rate. So these are not directly comparable. But nonetheless, you see the broader trend. The broader trend in advanced economies, which account for 45% of the global economy, is also downward, which obviously is not good. Compared to the previous decade, the decade before COVID, we have a much slower growth rate across all regions. And this is not the best decade this century. Actually, the first decade before the global financial crisis did substantially better. About 55%, more than half of all emerging markets and development economies, MD is my abbreviation, now have lower GDP per capita than they did just before COVID. I mean, obviously, it's a big problem. We see two very different stories on both sides of the Atlantic, and actually these determine a lot what is happening around the world. In the United States, we have a much more dynamic private sector, resilient retail sales, resilient consumers, of course, a much higher fiscal deficit, even in a period of very strong economic growth. That's why GDP in the US has already recovered to pre-COVID levels. Unemployment is at record lows, matching what were 50 years ago record low unemployment levels. In the euro area, by contrast, we have a very sluggish recovery. Growth is virtually non-existent, 0.5% last year, Germany in recession, other countries in recession, very weak manufacturing, exports coming down, imports obviously coming down, and as a result, we have this 5 percentage points gap between the trends in real GDP and the actual GDP in the Eurozone. I mean, interestingly, and you would note that in a period of rapidly slowing growth, last year, this year, we have a fiscal adjustment in the European Union. And so one has to think of what kind of fiscal rules we're going to look forward in that part of the continent that leads to fiscal adjustment at a time of much weaker economic growth, recession levels economic growth. Over the medium term, I think it's important to look at that. We have a structural growth slowdown around the world. Despite the optimism we have, and your minister expressed about Serbia, we have this structural slowdown around the world. Potential growth, which is the growth that a country can sustain without igniting inflation, is expected to fall to a 3-decade low over the remaining part of the 2020s. Here, the estimates we have, as I should have mentioned, As I should have mentioned, in advanced economies in 2020-2030, the potential growth rate is half what it used to be the first decade of this century. In emerging markets and developing economies is down by a third. And obviously, the main factors determining this is, you could say, less work, less trade, less investment. Here, the numbers on the potential growth rates. Here, the main contributions to this slower growth rate: lower total factor productivity, lower contribution from labor, lower contribution from capital, and as a result, much lower potential growth. Now, you're aware that around the world, despite all the talk of how important trade is, we have, and how important international trade is, has been for global prosperity since the fall of the Berlin Wall, trade has essentially ground to a halt. In 2023, we have barely any growth in trade overall, largely because growing trade in services by about 2% offset a decline in trade in goods. And so, what is behind all of this? I mean, obviously, a slower growth potential is something that we have to take into account, but we have a huge increase in the number of restrictive trade measures. You see here the trend in the level in 2015, the red line, much more restrictive trade measures compared to 2015. Let me now turn to the more interesting topic, and which is growing to high income. It's a major challenge, it's a major opportunity. For us, we tend to think of high income as a development stage. It's not just an income level. Even though for the World Bank, we have this income level about $13,000, which is redefined every year by inflating it by the SDR deflator. We define that level by which we quantify countries as high income versus middle income, and then below $1,000 or so as low income. But it's a development stage. It's not just the income, it's everything else. It's the quality of institutions, it's the quality of education, quality of the living environment. And so some of the key issues that the countries such as Serbia, Western Balkans, frankly, all countries of middle income Europe face are how to make the best of the EU integration. For some of them, it's EU accession, and for Serbia, this is a huge opportunity, despite all the problems in the European Union, and despite the fact, as Mr. Mali pointed out, that the weight of the European Union in global GDP has now declined to 17%, unlike in the United States, where that level has remained at about 25% over the last 3 decades. Education, for us, is the absolute priority to ensure that you can reach high income status. The other obviously very well connected part of this equation is private enterprise. Without private enterprise that is much more dynamic, much more able to bring foreign knowledge, foreign expertise through FDI, ability to innovate, move from the stage of investing just to build capital, to imitating and infusing foreign knowledge, to innovating. These are the key issues. And obviously, these days, nothing happens without the green transition. And the green transition has this huge opportunity for all countries to actually rejuvenate growth, because like any other previous technological revolution, it brings new technology, brings new ways of doing things, brings new skills, and brings into focus this emphasis on both human capital and private sector enterprise. So you know very well, this is the growth rate IVECA, Europe and Central Asia. We can have similar charts for pretty much all countries of Central and Eastern Europe and the Western Balkans. Growth picked up quite substantially, was the fastest growth since the transition in the first part of this decade. Things have come down afterwards quite dramatically, and we are obviously lagging as a region, or the Western Balkans as well, behind East Asia, excluding China, including China, it doesn't really matter. As a result, convergence, and this is GDP per capita, in purchasing power parity relative to the US, to the EU is very similar. As a result, convergence, you can see, has actually stalled. I have pointed here to Estonia because I like to bring Estonia every time I talk about small open economies. How a country of 1.5 million people that by 1991 was part of the Soviet Union, how it managed to become number 7 in the global ranking on PISA, within the global 10 on innovation, a home to companies such as Skype and Waze and many, many others, and now has GDP per capita in purchasing power parity that is on par with Korea and Japan. How did they achieve that? Why can't others do that? And I want to pass the message here that everybody can. If Estonia can, Serbia can, countries of the Western Balkans can as well. Now, looking over the last 30 years or so, since 1990, 27 countries around the world have become high income. 13 of them are in the EU. Bulgaria is on the threshold of becoming high-income economy, and that's why we call the EU the convergence machine, right? Every country that has become a member of the EU has managed to pass from middle income to high-income status. The other countries that have become high-income since 1990, some small islands dependent on tourism, commodity-dependent islands, commodity-dependent countries, and a few countries, obviously South Korea, Uruguay, Chile, Panama, and so forth. Now, I'm not going to go through this, but you can get my sense here that the policies that take a country from low income to middle income status, such as let's make sure everybody goes to school, let's make sure we have adequate investment, public investment, private investment, these policies are not going to take a country to high income status. To high income status, we need not only for kids to go to school, they need to learn how to think, they need to learn how to learn in the future, they need to have a much more open education system. On the investment side, companies invest not for the sake of investing, as they did when they go to middle income status, but to start to infuse the foreign knowledge, bring much more foreign knowledge into this, expand entrepreneurship, and move to the stage of innovation where they reach closer to the technological frontier on various stages. Now, we are producing a note which we hope we would be able to use to discuss with our client governments, including here in Serbia, on what it takes to go to high income status. And we're focusing on these three components here. Now, let me start with talent. This is not exactly human capital. It's a bit more wider than this, because it's the managing of talent, right? I mean, how do we ensure essentially three things? One, at very early stage, how not to miss the little Einsteins, how not to miss the talented kids that for a variety of reasons, because they belong to disadvantaged families, because the education system does not cover certain remote areas, how do they have a chance to go to school and do better than they otherwise could? Basic education is not enough, but is the huge foundation for a much better education later. Second, how do we give the opportunity for kids that now may, in many countries in Europe and Central Asia, may be tracked by grade 7, by grade 8, into professional schools, out of which there is no way to higher education? How do we move to a more comprehensive system of education so that even if you get tracked at a much later stage, perhaps at grade 9, into a professional school, you can still have a chance to go to do university education? And last but not least, how do we make sure that while universities and post-university education, PhDs, let's say, are open to everybody, right? So we are very inclusive, we are also very selective. Because in many of our countries in Europe and Central Asia, I'm from Bulgaria, we still have a lot of taxi drivers that have law degrees, engineering degrees, and drive taxis, because obviously these education systems have brought too many people without being selective enough. I'm just going to give this quick example of Finland, if you don't mind. I have a bit more time. And you know, before 1968, Finnish students were tracked into, right, into these grammar schools and then work-oriented civic schools. And in 1972, they introduced new legislation where they said, look, we're going to introduce a comprehensive education grades 1 to 9. Now it's actually expanded a little further. It's a mandatory 9 years. Now it's mandatory 12 years. And everybody's going to pass through that stage. After that, you can go to a vocational school. You can still go to university from that vocational school. We're going to overwhelm, they said. We're going to overwhelm teacher education. We're going to make sure that the teacher experience is radically changed. And as a result of this reform that also focused on the parents, Finland became number 7 on the global, on the PISA, on the OECD PISA scores. Estonia, Poland did similarly on comprehensive education reform. Japan did the same. And so I think it's important for all countries in developing Europe and Central Asia to think very substantially about how to make a much longer comprehensive education where tracking is delayed, right, until later, and tracking into a professional school also gives you a chance to go to university rather than, as it is now in most of the countries, you go to a technical school for a seamstress or a mechanic, and then you can obviously not go to university. Now, what has happened to Poland? I think this is an interesting chart. In 1992-94, in Poland, the number of jobs, the share of jobs that required higher education was about 12%. Now, this little number I have on the right is almost 38%, right? This massive shift in Polish education where the quality of basic secondary education improves so dramatically. Poland is, again, in the top 10 on the PISA scores, improved so dramatically. At the same time, the economy developed so dramatically. Enterprises boomed, brought more innovation, brought more entrepreneurship, so that this investment is not just investment for the investment's sake, but it's investment to actually create new value added. I want to end here this section on education on a topic of intergenerational mobility. I know it's very important. Intergenerational mobility, we're looking here at if your parents, for example, in this case, if your parents have secondary or higher education, do children have secondary and higher education? And so obviously for high income countries, this correlation, right, between parents and children is much higher. Yet, we think it is a big problem if children's ability to go to school is reduced, children's ability to go to university is reduced by the fact that parents did not go to university. And so therefore, while in our education systems, in our societies, we have to make sure that hard work and talent are rewarded, right, and rewarded amply to create incentives for people to study and to learn and to grow, we should not allow that reward for hard work and talent to pass into the next generation in the sense that those who did not work hard, their children cannot go to school. So it's absolutely essential for having a much more mobile, high-income societies to have a higher degree of intergenerational mobility. If your parents didn't go to university, nothing prevents you from going. Their socioeconomic status does not prevent you from going. Let me talk a little bit about enterprises, and I have very little time, as the engine of innovation and growth. I'm going to say a few things here. You know that structural transformation is the main engine of productivity growth. And we know that both in Europe and Central Asia and around the world, we have the slowdown in productivity growth in every area. But in Europe and Central Asia, the middle-income countries rely less on innovation than middle-income countries in other regions. Obviously, compared to the high-income countries of the European Union, we lag quite dramatically behind. Very few firms in the middle-income countries of ECA actually innovate. And so while good management skills, entrepreneurships are key for that, actually very few firms are well managed. That percent is growing, but it's not growing substantially enough. Here is the slowdown in productivity I mentioned, much larger slowdown from the red line to the blue bar in ECA than, for example, in some of the other regions. And you know very well that the early period of the early 1990s, we had a very dramatic improvement in these reform scores. These are the EBRD transition indicators. They go until 2014, after which they were changed. And by the global financial crisis, 2009, these transition indicators are plateauing. After that, the EBRD, brought these transition qualities. I mean, you can see that while these transition qualities have improved, right, the blue bars are a little larger in 2023 compared to 2016. They're not much larger. The red bars have not moved much. This is Serbia. The rhombus has also not moved much. And so therefore, the assessment that in developing Europe and Central Asia, the progress on structural reforms has stalled is there. While the world is moving, obviously the European Union is not moving fast enough, but the world is changing. The countries of Europe and Central Asia transition has stalled. And so this is a big problem that underpins why our structural transformation is slower, while growth rates in Europe and Central Asia have now come down quite dramatically. Actually, we look at the developing countries, so the middle-income countries of Europe and Central Asia. They're the first 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, the first 8 countries. In the first 8 countries, you can see that, and actually Serbia probably I think has to go down, but the first 7 countries, most of the growth, and this is the decomposition of productivity growth, most of the growth comes from reallocation, right? Market reallocation between activities, between firms, rather than innovation. For the 3 high-income countries at the bottom, you can see that it is mostly this, within firm dynamics, within firm better management competencies, more innovation that is driving productivity growth. On the Global Innovation Index, we like to think that we have had a very good background of quality education. We are close to the European Union. We trade a lot with the European Union. But yet, the middle-income countries of ECA, Europe and Central Asia, lag behind East Asia and Pacific. I mean, these countries there are doing much better on innovation. It's not just China. It is very interesting when we look at the number of patents as a measure of firm innovation, that the number of patents, and these are normalized, right? So number of patents per 100,000 people, so it doesn't depend on the size of the economy. One gets the impression that around the world it's largely the high-income economies and China. And everybody else around the middle-income countries of the world, there is virtually no innovation going on. One interesting fact about the economies of Europe and Central Asia, this mirrors very much what is happening to the middle-income economies in other parts of the world, is that firms enter the market and then they don't grow much. For some of the countries of Central Asia, this depends on a rather predatory governments that may take a stake in the company. For others, it's lack of an appropriate business environment. Interestingly, I'm very pleased to show here that in Serbia, this growth is actually much more substantial than in some other countries in the region. But if you look at countries such as India, Mexico, and so forth, there, this growth is on the level of Kosovo and Bulgaria, right? So after 5 years, these companies barely grow. The role of the state, nothing new here to all of you, I'm sure. We have a new database called the Business of the State that shows the share of economic sectors in the economy, right, in which the government has a stake larger than 10%. So it's not just 50%, SOE's stake of more than 10%. 40% in the western part of ECA, which is the Western Balkans, Moldova, Belarus, Ukraine. And in the eastern part, Central Asia, Caucasus, more than 60% of the sectors of the economy have government shares. Let me quickly talk about energy because it is so important in this transition to high income for middle-income countries in ECA. I mean, every country that has become high income around the world has become high income on the basis of abundant and affordable energy. And a lot of that energy, of course, was fossil fuels, and that's why the advanced economies account for a large share of the cumulative fossil fuel emissions. EU and US each account for about 20%, and together with Japan and the UK, you get a 50% share for these economies. And so for the countries of Europe and Central Asia, the challenge is how these countries that now, in per capita terms, are the largest emitters, that have some of the most energy-intensive economies in the world, how can they accelerate the transition, because that would help accelerate growth by bringing new technologies? What would it take for them to both do the growth part and do the decarbonization part? And so some of the obstacles, so there are quite a few obstacles to this transition, and some of them are that we still have very large monopolies, essentially the SOEs. In some countries, we have state-connected enterprises that are not state-owned, but are still state-connected. The aging transmission networks, the new generation capacity that's provided by wind, solar, other renewables that are more intermittent, have larger amplitudes, cannot be handled by the existing transmission networks. And the power dispatch, right? What power source is used by the dispatcher to send to households and other consumers doesn't often reflect the power that is at the lowest cost. And so when we look at countries around the world that have done much better on the efforts to decarbonize, those that have more room for markets, that have also decoupled, that have also split their generation, transmission, that have less incumbent pressure, less pressure from SOEs, have younger firms that are allowed to enter, and this talks about also about our efforts on the enterprise side, they have done better. I'm showing you here a few charts that show you how some countries, the high-income economies, have managed to decouple growth and emissions, right? Growth, GDP, cumulative GDP growth over the last 2 decades is the positive blue bar, the emissions is the red bar, and you can see that for high-income economies, they have decoupled. Middle-income countries, they have slowed growth in emissions, and pretty much most everybody else, emissions are growing very strongly. And this is the conclusion across regions. Here is high-income economies. The solid blue line is the growth in GDP, the cumulative growth in GDP. The dotted line is growth in emissions. Middle-income countries are on top. And want to end here that despite a very substantial decline in energy intensity, in ECHO it remains very high. So it's obviously something that limits productivity growth, something that limits efficiency of enterprises, makes it more problematic, and especially for the countries of the Western Balkans, Turkey, now facing with the cross-border adjustment mechanism that the EU is going to introduce from January 2026, actually there will be a substantial problem. I'm going to end here. Thank you very much for your attention. Want to emphasize again that the biggest opportunity for Serbia, in our view, is to grab the EU convergence machine, make the best of it, because not every country, such as Bulgaria, for example, has not made the best of this convergence machine. Thank you so much.